The soft hum of medical equipment filled the sterile air of room 5009 at St. Cla's private hospital. The sharp scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, blending with the fading fragrance of fresh flowers left behind by visitors who had long stopped coming, and the center of the room, connected to machines that tracked every heartbeat and breath, lay Alexander Grant. Once a powerhouse in New York's business world, he was now motionless, trapped in a coma. Emily Carter adjusted her gloves as she prepared to change his bandages. At 24, she had only been a nurse for 2 years, but her dedication and compassion made her stand out among her colleagues. She believed that even in the most hopeless cases, her presence could make a difference. And Alexander was her biggest challenge yet. He had been unconscious for 6 months after a devastating car accident. His wealthy, influential family had spared no expense on his care, but their faith in his recovery had long since faded. To them, he was just a shadow of the man they once knew. But to Emily, he was still in there, somewhere beneath the silence. She gently cleaned the wounds on his arms and adjusted the sheets. She spoke to him, just as she did every day. "Well, Alex," she said lightly, "you wouldn't believe the morning I had." The coffee machine broke again. "I swear the universe is against me having caffeine." She chuckled softly, even though she knew he wouldn't respond. "But don't worry, I won't make you listen to me complain for too long." Talking to him had become second nature. It filled the silence, making the room feel less like a waiting tomb and more like a space where life still existed. She told him about her day, her frustrations, her small victories, sometimes even her fears. She didn't know why she felt so connected to him, but something about his still, peaceful face made her believe he could hear her. Just as she was adjusting his fore, the sharp sound of high heels echoed down the hallway. The rhythmic clicking grew louder until the door swung open forcefully, rattling the walls. Victoria Grant, Alexander's mother, entered like an icy gust of wind. She carried her wealth like armor, designer clothes perfectly tailored, not a single strand of her hair out of place. But her cold, piercing blue eyes held no warmth. Emily instinctively straightened, masking her surprise. "What are you doing?" Victoria's voice was sharp, laced with disapproval as her gaze swept over Emily, pausing on the way her hands rested gently on Alexander's arm. Emily calmly removed her gloves, disposing of them before turning to face Victoria. "I'm changing his bandages, Mrs. Grant." Victoria's lips curled into a sneer. "I didn't ask what you were doing. I asked why you are the one doing it. I told the hospital I wanted the best care for my son, not some inexperienced nurse playing caretaker." Emily's jaw tightened, but she kept her tone composed. "I understand your concerns, but I was assigned to Mr. Grant's case because I am qualified. I treat all my patients with the utmost care, regardless of their status." Victoria stepped closer, her heels clicking ominously against the tile. "You might fool others with your sweet little bedside manner, but I see right through you. You're here because you're cheap, convenient, and replaceable. Do your job and keep your emotions out of it. My son doesn't need your sympathy." Emily clenched her fists at her sides, forcing herself to remain calm. Taking a deep breath, she met Victoria's icy glare with quiet strength. "I'm here to help your son," she said firmly. "Whether you believe it or not, I will continue to care for him with the respect and dignity he deserves. I won't abandon him just because it's easier to give up." For a brief moment, something flickered in Victoria's eyes, as if Emily's words had touched a nerve. But just as quickly, the steel returned to her gaze. "We'll see how long that lasts," she muttered before turning on her heel and sweeping out of the room, leaving behind a trail of tension. As the door clicked shut, silence settled over the room once again, heavy and thick. Emily let out a slow breath, turning back to Alexander. She smoothed the sheets over his chest, her hands lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "I'm sorry about that," she whispered. Whispering softly, her voice now barely audible, Emily leaned in. "Your mother's... well, you know." She pulled a chair up to Alexander's bedside and sat down, resting her elbows on her knees. The steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, a sound that had become oddly comforting over time. "I don't care what she says," Emily continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I believe you're still in there, fighting. And I'm not going anywhere, Alex. I promise." As she sat there, the only sounds were the machines and Alexander's quiet, steady breathing. But deep within his unconscious mind, something stirred, a faint flicker of awareness. Emily didn't realize it yet, but her words weren't just empty conversation. They were a lifeline, pulling Alexander closer to the surface, closer to the world he had left behind. And soon, everything would change. The days at St. Cela's private hospital blurred together, one indistinguishable from the next. For most, room 5009 was just another place where hope slowly faded. But for Emily Carter, it had become the center of her world. Tea was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, one of those days where the world outside seemed to hold its breath, that something different happened. Emily was carefully changing Alexander Grant's bandages, her hands steady from weeks of practice. She hummed softly, a tune she wasn't even aware she had memorized, filling the sterile silence of the room. As she reached for a fresh gauze pad, she felt it, faint, almost imperceptible, a twitch beneath her fingers. Her eyes darted to his hand, disbelief flooding her senses. Was that real? She stared, holding her breath, waiting to see if it would happen again. After a few seconds of nothing, she shook her head, dismissing it as her imagination playing tricks on her. Maybe it was just a muscle spasm, something involuntary. But as she continued her work, her heart beat a little faster, the moment replaying in her mind over and over. Later that evening, as she prepared to leave, the image of Alexander's twitching fingers haunted her thoughts. Against her better judgment, she returned to his room, standing by his bedside, watching him, willing him to move again. Nothing. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing. The next morning, she approached Dr. Harris, the attending physician overseeing Alexander's case. She hesitated outside his office before finally knocking. "Come in," his deep voice echoed. Emily stepped inside, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Dr. Harris, I think I noticed something unusual with Mr. Grant yesterday." Dr. Harris raised an eyebrow, peering over his glasses. "Unusual?" "Yes." Emily nodded. "His fingers, they twitched. Twice." The doctor sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Emily, we've seen involuntary muscle reflexes before in coma patients. It's common. It doesn't necessarily indicate cognitive function." "But this felt different," she insisted, her voice firm but respectful. "It wasn't just a spasm. It was." She stopped, realizing how she sounded. "Hopeful." Naive. Dr. Harris offered her a sympathetic smile. "I appreciate your dedication, Emily. But you can't let yourself get too attached. I know it's hard, but sometimes, patients don't come back." Emily swallowed hard, nodding. But as she left his office, she knew she couldn't let it go. From that day forward, Emily became even more attentive. She spent every free moment at Alexander's bedside, gently stretching his limbs, massaging his muscles, and speaking to him as if he were wide awake. "Good morning, Alex," she'd whisper, pulling back the curtains to let the sunlight stream into the room. "You should see how beautiful it is outside today. I think you'd like it." She told him about the mundane details of her life, her annoying neighbor who blasted music at 3 a.m., the elderly patient down the hall who called her Sunshine, and how she missed her father, who had passed away when she was a child. She spoke of her mother's illness, the endless hospital bills, and the exhaustion of keeping everything together. And even though he never responded, Emily felt like Alexander was listening. One evening, a heavy storm rolled through the city. Rain lashed against the hospital windows, thunder rumbling in the distance. Emily's shift had ended hours ago, but she found herself unable to leave. Something about the storm made her feel like Alexander shouldn't be alone. She pulled a chair closer to his bed, wrapping her hands around a lukewarm cup of coffee. The only light in the room came from the dim glow of the heart monitor, casting soft green reflections on the walls. "You know," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I used to love storms when I was little. My dad would let me sit by the window with him, and we'd count the seconds between the lightning and thunder." She paused, her gaze drifting to Alexander's still face. "But after he died, storms just felt lonely." The words hung heavy in the room, mingling with the distant rumble of thunder. Emily set her coffee down and reached for Alexander's hand, holding it gently between her own. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she murmured, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "Maybe because you're the only one who won't tell me everything will be okay when it won't. Or maybe I just don't want to feel like I'm the only one still fighting." A single tear slipped down her cheek, landing softly on the back of his hand. She wiped it away quickly, embarrassed by her own vulnerability, even in front of someone who couldn't hear her. But then, it happened, a subtle, undeniable squeeze of her fingers. Emily's breath hitched. She froze, staring down at their intertwined hands, her heart pounding in her chest. "Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Did you?" She waited, eyes wide, pulse racing. But the moment passed, and his hand went limp again, as if it had never moved at all. Emily blinked back tears, unsure if she was imagining things. But deep down, she knew what she had felt. Something inside Alexander Grant was waking up, and the days that followed, Emily became more devoted than ever. Despite the skepticism of her colleagues, her belief never wavered. She continued to talk to Alexander, to share her fears, her hopes, and her dreams, unaware that with each word, she was pulling him closer to the surface. And though he couldn't speak or move yet, Alexander was listening, and the depths of his mind, her voice was the anchor holding him steady in the storm of his unconsciousness. The warmth of her touch, the sincerity of her words, they were the lifeline pulling him back to the world. And soon, the world would see the impossible happen. The morning sun spilled through the blinds of room 5009. Soft golden light streamed through the blinds, casting a gentle glow over the stark white hospital sheets. Emily Carter nudged the door open with her usual careful touch, balancing a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a clipboard in the other. She expected another routine morning, but the moment she stepped inside, a strange feeling settled over her. The steady hum of the machines was the same, but something felt different. She turned toward Alexander Grant, expecting to see the same stillness that had defined him for months. Instead, her breath caught. His eyes were open, wide, clear, and unmistakably aware. For a heartbeat, Emily froze. Was she imagining things? Was exhaustion playing tricks on her? But no, the longer she looked, the more undeniable it became. "Alex," she whispered, her voice shaking, barely louder than the soft beeping of a heart monitor. His gaze didn't waver. The once lifeless, distant blue eyes now shone with recognition. The coffee slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor, but she barely noticed. Her heart pounded, a whirlwind of shock and relief crashing over her. She rushed to his side, fumbling to press the emergency button, her eyes never leaving his face. "Alex, can you hear me?" she asked, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. His lips moved slightly, trying to form words, though his body wasn't quite ready. But his eyes said everything. Tears blurred Emily's vision as she gripped his hand. She felt it, the faintest pressure of his fingers curling around hers. Weak, but real. "You're back," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're really back." The room soon filled with doctors and nurses, their faces a mix of disbelief and urgency as they assessed Alexander. Dr. Harris, the attending physician who had long dismissed Emily's hope, stood frozen for a moment before quickly snapping into action. But through all the commotion, Alexander's gaze never left Emily, and the days that followed, his recovery stunned the entire hospital. Though his speech was slow to return, his mind was sharp, and his determination was unshakable. Physical therapy was grueling, but he pushed through, fueled by a silent strength that amazed even his doctors. But there was something else, something no one but Emily seemed to notice. After every exhausting session, when most patients would rest, Alexander would search for her. The moment she entered the room, his expression softened. His fingers tapped faintly against the sheets whenever she spoke, as if trying to respond before his voice could catch up. Then, one evening, after visiting hours had ended, he finally found the strength to speak. Emily sat by his bedside, tracing idle patterns on the back of his hand as she talked about her day. "I swear, if the coffee machine breaks one more time, I'm going to lose it," she chuckled, shaking her head. "You'd think a hospital this fancy could at least keep one working." A faint smile touched Alexander's lips. And then, to her shock, he whispered hoarsely, "I heard all of it." Emily's breath caught. She turned sharply to him, her heart hammering. "What?" His eyes locked onto hers, steady and sincere. "Every word. Every story." A lump formed in her throat as the weight of his words settled over her. "You kept me alive," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. She swallowed hard, shaking her head. "I was just doing my job." Alexander's gaze darkened slightly, his grip tightening ever so slightly around hers. "No. It was more than that." In the weeks that followed, their bond deepened. Alexander confided in her more than anyone else, sharing memories of his life before the accident, his fears about the future, the loneliness that came with wealth and status. In return, Emily opened up in ways she never had before, about her father's death, her mother's illness, the exhaustion of holding everything together alone. With each conversation, each shared moment, something unspoken grew between them. Every lingering glance, every accidental brush of fingertips sent a silent message neither of them dared put into words. Until one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alexander finally shattered the silence. "Emily," he whispered, his voice stronger now. "I need to tell you something." Her heart stuttered. "What is it?" His hand trembled slightly as he reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch sent a shiver down her spine. "You didn't just save my life," he murmured. "You saved me." Emily's breath hitched. "And now," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "I can't imagine my life without you." Her eyes burned with unshed tears. She shook her head, her voice trembling. "Alex, I don't know what to say." His gaze pleaded with hers. "Say you feel it too." She closed her eyes, fighting the flood of emotions crashing through her. For so long, she had told herself she was just his nurse. Nothing more. But with his heart laid bare before her, she couldn't deny the truth. When she opened her eyes, she saw it reflected in his own, the same truth that echoed in her chest. "I do," she whispered. "I feel it too." And in that moment, surrounded by the rhythmic beeping of machines and the fading golden light, they both knew nothing would ever be the same again. But their moment of quiet realization didn't last long. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen over St. Cela's private hospital, another kind of storm rolled in. Not from the sky, but from the polished marble hallways leading to room 5009. Victoria Grant entered like a force of nature. Clad in a perfectly tailored suit, her heels clicked against the tile with sharp precision. Her icy blue eyes, so much like her son's, scanned the room with practiced control. Emily felt her stomach twist. She knew exactly who this woman was. And one look at Victoria Grant's face told her she wasn't here for a heartfelt reunion. Everything was about to change, again, as Alexander sat propped up in bed. He let out a soft chuckle at something Emily had just whispered. The moment felt natural, easy, her hand resting lightly on his arm, his eyes shining with warmth, a stark contrast to how they usually looked when his mother was around. But this wasn't just casual familiarity. It was something deeper, something Victoria Grant recognized immediately and refused to accept. Her voice cut through the atmosphere like a blade. "Well," she said with a sharp sneer, folding her arms, "I see the rumors weren't exaggerated." Emily stiffened, her heart pounding as she turned to face Victoria. The warmth in Alexander's expression vanished, replaced by a tense, guarded look. "Mother," Alexander said coolly, his voice steady but edged with warning. "What are you doing here?" Victoria's gaze remained locked on Emily. "I should be asking her that." She took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. "Tell me, Miss Carter, how long did it take? How long before you realized you could manipulate my son while he was at his weakest?" Emily's face flushed with shock and anger. "Mrs. Grant, with all due respect, I have never—" Victoria cut her off, her voice rising. "Don't lie to me. Do you think I can't see what's happening here? You latched onto him when he was helpless, playing the hero, hoping to secure a place in his will." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The accusation stung deeper than she expected. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but the weight of Victoria's words filled the room, suffocating. Alexander's jaw tightened as he sensed Emily's distress. "Enough, Mother." His voice was stronger than it had been in weeks. "Emily saved my life. She cares about me. This isn't about money, and you know it." Victoria's lips curled in satisfaction. "Of course she cares. Why wouldn't she? You're Alexander Grant, the millionaire who can give her everything she never had." The words echoed through the room, and suddenly, Emily felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her heart pounded, but this time, it wasn't from affection, it was humiliation. She took a shaky step back, her voice barely a whisper. "Is that what you think, Alex?" Alexander turned to her, his expression softening. "No, Emily, you know I don't." She shook her head, eyes glistening. "Do I? Or was I just another project? Someone you felt obligated to care about because I was there when no one else was?" Alexander's face fell, the words hitting harder than any physical blow. "I need to go," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. Without another word, she turned and rushed out of the room, leaving Alexander struggling to rise from the bed, his heart shattering with every step she took away from him. The days that followed were hollow. Alexander tried everything, calls, messages, even asking the hospital staff, but Emily had vanished. It was as if she had never been part of his life, leaving behind only the ghost of her presence in a now unbearably empty hospital room. Without her, the walls felt like they were closing in. His recovery slowed, his motivation fading. The therapists noticed, but he brushed off their concerns with empty reassurances. But at night, when the world was silent, the emptiness was suffocating. He closed his eyes and heard her voice, soft, soothing, telling him stories of her childhood, her fears, her dreams. He missed her laughter, the warmth of her hand in his, the way she saw him, not as the millionaire, not as the patient, but as a person. And now, he wasn't sure he could face a life without her. Meanwhile, Emily buried herself in routine, taking shifts at another hospital across town. But no amount of work could fill the void Alexander had left behind. She replayed their last conversation over and over, questioning everything. Did he really love me, or was it just gratitude? Did I let myself believe in something that was never real? But no matter how much she tried to convince herself that leaving was the right choice, her heart betrayed her. She missed him, his stubbornness, his wit, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he thought about her too. Wondering if she had made a mistake by walking away. Weeks passed, and Alexander, unable to bear the weight of his own regret, decided to take matters into his own hands. With the help of his assistant, he organized a press conference. Not for the media, not for publicity, but for her. Standing behind the podium in a tailored suit, he looked every bit the powerful businessman the world knew him to be. But today, he wasn't here as a millionaire. He was here as a man, stripped of pride and pretense, with nothing left to lose. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward, expecting news about his recovery or business ventures. But Alexander's gaze wasn't on them. His eyes, filled with raw emotion, stared straight into the cameras, as if trying to reach her. "I'm not here to talk about my company," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I'm not here to discuss my recovery or future business plans." The room fell silent, anticipation heavy in the air. "I'm here to talk about the woman who saved my life." Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Alexander didn't care. "Her name is Emily Carter. She was my nurse, but more than that, she was my light in the darkest time of my life. When I was lost in a coma, it was her voice, her kindness, her strength that pulled me back." He paused, his throat tightening. "I didn't just wake up because of medical care. I woke up because of her. And somewhere along the way, I realized it wasn't just gratitude. I was in love." Across town, in her small apartment, Emily sat frozen in front of the TV, tears streaming down her face. His words shattered every doubt, every fear, and for the first time, she let herself accept the truth she had been too scared to face. She still loved him. Without another thought, she grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, her heart pounding with hope and desperation. Some loves are too powerful to walk away from. And she wasn't going to lose him again. You need to know that what we had wasn't just a result of circumstance, it was real. "I love you, and I don't want to spend another day without you." Miles away, in her small apartment, Emily Carter sat frozen in front of her old television, tears streaming down her cheeks. She could barely breathe as Alexander's words filled the room, breaking down every wall she had built around her heart. Her mind flashed through every moment they had shared. His soft smiles, the way his eyes lit up when she entered the room, the gentle way he had touched her hand. It wasn't just gratitude, it was love. She had been too afraid to believe it before, but now, hearing him declare it to the world, there was no denying it. Grabbing her coat, Emily rushed out the door, her heart pounding as if it were leading her back to him. In St. Célaine's private hospital, Alexander sat in the physical therapy room, replaying the press conference over and over in his mind. Doubts crept in. What if she hadn't seen it? What if she didn't believe him? Just as despair threatened to take over, the door creaked open, turned, and there she was. Emily stood in the doorway, her eyes glistening with tears, her breath shaky as she took him in. For a moment, neither of them moved, the world around them fading away. Then, with determination, Alexander pushed himself up from the chair. His legs trembled beneath him, the pain sharp, but he didn't care. With the help of his crutches, he took one step, then another, until he stood just inches from her. Emily's heart ached at the sight, but it was the look in his eyes that broke her completely. Raw, vulnerable, and filled with a love so pure it made her breath hitch. Without thinking, she threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest as sobs racked her body. "I'm so sorry," she whispered through her tears. "I should have never left. I love you, Alex." I've loved you for so long." Alexander's arms tightened around her, his own tears falling freely. "You're here," he whispered, his voice cracking. "That's all that matters." They stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, letting the world fade away. In that moment, all the pain and misunderstandings disappeared. All that remained was them. Months later, life had found a new rhythm. Emily opened a community health clinic, dedicating her life to helping those who couldn't afford the care they needed. Alexander, stepping away from the ruthless world of business, focused on charitable work, using his wealth to fund programs for underprivileged communities. But most importantly, they built a life together, a life filled with laughter, love, and healing. Their days were no longer defined by hospital walls but by the adventures they shared and the simple joy of being by each other's side. They weren't just lovers, they were partners, soulmates. And as they sat on the porch of their small countryside home, watching the sun set over the horizon, Emily rested her head on Alexander's shoulder, whispering the words that had brought them back to each other. "You saved me too." And so, Emily and Alexander found not just healing but a love that defied all odds, a love born in silence, nurtured through struggle, and strengthened by every obstacle life threw their way. Their journey reminds us that sometimes, the people who save us are the ones we least expect. And in the end, love isn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It's about being there when it matters most. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more tales of love, resilience, and unexpected miracles. Turn on your notifications so you never miss a story that could inspire you or even change your life. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next heartwarming story.